Nancy and I would like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual book launch today. It's really a project that we care a lot about and are so grateful to all of you for your various contributions as chapter authors or audience members who are just interested in hearing more about our work. So thank you so much for coming together with us today. I thought that I would begin by just sharing a little bit of background on the volume, and then we will actually take a quick glance at each of the different chapters because it's an edited collection. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or you can save them for later, and we'll try to answer any questions that any guests or attendees may have. So to just orient you to the volume, share a little bit about the background. It really has been many years in the making. When I was working on my books, Growing Up with Girl Power and The Princess Problem, I found that it wasn't possible to discuss how girls negotiate children's media culture without also considering the roles of toys in their lives. Media properties' toyetic nature, meaning their potential for marketability in toy form, influences what appears on screen. And in my research, I found that toys based on on-screen characters sometimes became really important components of girls' lives. They would bring associated with shows and movies into their lives, even when they were nowhere near a screen, which was really interesting to see in person. But in trying to write about these phenomena, I quickly recognized a gap in the literature. Children's toys and their marketing are rarely subjected to the kind of critical cultural studies analyses that characterize so much of children's media studies scholarship. So this volume, in tandem with the recent volume, Cultural Studies of Lego, which I know I'm in a tiny screen, but for those of you who haven't seen it, many folks here today were involved in this as well. Sharon Mazzarella and I published that with Palgrave in 2019, so same publisher, same series. It's meant to address that gap, these volumes together. So with the help of many wonderful contributors, my collaborator Nancy, Jennings, and I created this book for scholars and students who have an interest in children's culture and are interested in considering children's consumer culture and toy marketing from a critical perspective. So rather than offering a marketing how-to, in this book, we examine the ideologies and cultural implications of the toy marketing industry. We consider the power dynamics that shape how toy marketers communicate with members of their target audiences. And in the volume, we bring together scholars from a range of backgrounds, such as critical media studies, but also English and mass communication and law. And we're really grateful that several of them could join us for this book launch today. As you'll hear, they apply their expertise to the marketing of children's toys and play across a range of topics, including the history of toy marketing, matters of representation, such as race, gender, and ethnicity, and audience reception of children's toys and play, as well as specific product categories and even specific brands. We're really grateful to them for their outstanding work in children's toys and their marketing. So with that having been said, I'd like to take a moment very quickly to thank and acknowledge folks behind the scenes, in addition to those whose work you'll be hearing about today, for their amazing work. The Palgrave, Macmillan, Springer Nature team are just such professionals and so incredibly good at supporting editors and authors through the publication process. There's a lot behind the scenes, and I learn from them constantly. I also want to thank Morgan Blue, who was our indexer for this project. She's of Blue Indexing and Editorial Services, and she did a wonderful job preparing a really high quality index that will help folks find the materials that they're interested in quickly. Additionally, at Salem State, I had a wonderful graduate assistant, Simone Dancier, and I also received support from the University Research Committee, the School of Graduate Studies, and the College of Arts and Sciences. And Nancy at the University of Cincinnati received support from the Department of Communication and the Taft Research Center. So to begin, I would like to turn things over for a while to Nancy. She will introduce a few of the chapters. And then we'll come back to me for a few more of the chapters, and then we'll have time for a question and answer period. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to thank also our reviewers and endorsers who I cannot forget. They were wonderful. Miriam Foreman-Brunel, Maya Gotts, and Daphne Lemish were really, really terrific, in providing with us endorsements for the volume. And of course, all the contributors who are here today. So without further ado, Nancy will begin by sharing a little bit from the introduction to the volume.
Absolutely, great. So yes, so the introduction actually kind of summarized Rebecca's introduction kind of introduced the first chapter as well. So, but I will read a little bit from the chapter as well, and then we will go through each of the introduce each of the chapters, and our contributors then can add in as we get to your chapter your contribution for today's. The concepts of childhood, play, and leisure were not always interconnected. There once was a time when brand names, toys, and advertisements informing children and their parents of toys didn't exist. Much of this changed in the US in the 1950s with the growth of television, which brought toy manufacturers into family homes through advertisements. In the ensuing decades, children's status as consumers only grew in the eyes of marketers. And as children matured in an increasingly commercialized environment, consumer culture socializes them, shaping their social and personal identities. While much of the research of children, media, and marketing comes from a tradition of media effects research, increasingly scholars have been exploring children's culture and media practices using a critical cultural lens. Like all cultural artifacts, toys and their marketing make and transmit meaning. In recent years, children's brands, networks, and marketing trends have been the subject of sustained critical analysis. And there have been several books, as Rebecca referred to earlier, including the Lego book, that have addressed some of these different networks and brands and toys. But with this book, we're hoping to add to the growing body of literature, offering a rich critical perspective on a variety of toys, brands, and marketing techniques. So without further ado, let's move on to our exciting chapters. And so let's see, our next chapter would be chapter 2. So chapter 2 is Playing with Fire, Marketing Youth Toy and Working Firearms as Social Problems and Social Panacea by Jody Lene Madeira, and she's here today. So Jody, would you like to speak a little bit about your chapter?
She sent me a message in the chat saying she had to step out to give a separate presentation at a conference that's happening right now, and that she hopes to come back. So if she returns, we can come back to her chapter later.
Perfect. Okay. So then the next chapter is Reclaiming the Living Room, The Play Value of Grotesque Toys by Tyler Burnett, a lecturer at the Department of Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And I don't believe Tyler is here, so we can go on to chapter 4, which is Playing with Minimalism, How Parents Are Sold on High-End Toys and Childhood Simplicity by Spring Servandi Duval, and she is here.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Rebecca and Nancy, for setting this up. I am at Salem College in North Carolina, and my interest is often in the commodification of social movements and activism, and the sorts of behaviors and activities that may seem to be antagonistic to capitalism, but then are co-opted and commodified. So commodity feminism, commodity activism, and more recently, the commodification of DIY cultures and minimalism, which may seem to reject capitalism and consumerism, but is often commodified for profit, not just for high-end corporations, but also for bloggers, social media influencers, and more that discourse of minimalism as a sort of Something that you can buy and that will solve all of your problems is also being marketed to parents as a way to solve parenting problems and home problems, whether their children agree or not. So to just share a little bit from my chapter, one minimalist blogger writes, "If I went by what my children said brings them joy, I would be surrounded by piles of torn papers, broken cars, and scattered plastic bits and baubles, gibbering like a loon." Rejecting the conventional wisdom that simplicity can mean children are happier playing with a cardboard box than with the expensive toy they unwrapped, bloggers often supplant simple childhood happiness with a performative minimalism that promises results for parents. Much of minimalism's promotion can be understood as advice for optimizing professional success, hacking one's life, and in fact, hacking your parenting and children. Minimalism is presented and practiced in contemporary social media spaces, often not as the simple lack of material goods, but the specific curation of fewer high-end goods that signal the consumer's choice to utilize their purchasing power in specific ways. I'm going to give you one example that really stuck out in my analysis. One product sold on the blog and online shop, Imagine Childhood, is a collection of 26 jumbo branch blocks made in Germany for over $40, and the sellers claim they teach a variety of skills from cognitive to social. These quote unquote rustic blocks are simply cut pieces of branches. I can't emphasize enough that there is nothing more here. There's no intricate shapes, there's no design, there's no paint, there's no nothing, there's nothing going on. They're cut branches. They're not even sealed. So in fact, the copy warns that, quote, bark may be loose, check toys frequently to ensure small children don't choke. So herein lies a significant contradiction. The blog and the shop and many of the social media influencers encourage minimalism as a way to simplify your life and encourage spending lots of time out in nature, where they would likely encounter sticks and branches. But the brand also sells parents on high-end pre-cut branches to bring into their homes. So this version of simplicity is accessible only to the economically privileged who have access to both the idyllic natural spaces and have the funds to purchase simplicity. A beautifully styled photo and sales pitch make these expensive blocks seem more special than the free sticks children might play with in a park. So I enjoyed writing this chapter, and I'm happy to answer questions later.
Great, thank you so much, Spring. Okay, so our next chapter is Imported Toys in Indonesia, Parental Consumer Literacy, Purchasing Decisions, and Globalizations by Rani Chandra Okavani, sorry if I'm butchering names, and Fadlan Nur Ikwan. And we were really excited to have not only stories and information, chapters about toys in the United States, but also toys around the world. So there are a couple of chapters that talk about toys and marketing in different places of the world. So I hope you enjoy those. Our next chapter is Ryan's World and the Toy Review Genre's Impact on Children's Culture. And that's by Kira Hunting. And I believe Kira is here. Yes, there she is.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Hi.
My toddler is also here, so heads up. There may or may not be a cameo followed by me being confused about what's going on. That's happened many conferences this year. Interestingly, my toddler is not the inspiration for this piece because I have very strong feelings about the unboxing genre, so my child doesn't watch them. But my nieces really watched a lot of unboxing videos, and I became really interested in both their appeals to kids, but also how they were fitting into a changing toy landscape where the surprise toy becomes more and more central, and a changing mainstream media, like traditional media landscape, where child influencers are becoming today's television stars, not just in the sense that they used to be, where they were like standing in for today's television stars, but channels like Nick Jr. have explicitly been tapping influencers to become the hosts of their new programming on the channel. So it's a big change. So mostly what I did for this chapter was studied Ryan's World, which is one of the most, if you haven't heard of it, most lucrative YouTube channels anywhere, and certainly the most lucrative child influencer channel on YouTube, and watched how it evolved from explicitly sort of this amateur, in quotation marks, because clearly their parents were very involved in making it a very professional experience and looks, toy play unboxing video, to something that becomes increasingly institutionalized as it has a partnership with Pocket Watch, which is like an influencer management company, and then eventually becomes a toy line that creates the surprise toys that originally Ryan unboxed, to eventually being multi-integrated with a toy line, relationships with Walmart, relationships with Target, multimedia platforms like video games, and then ultimately his own Nick Jr. show, which departs from toys entirely, but keeps the structure of the toy play and the unboxing play that Ryan explores. And so the chapter really focuses on giving you that history and then placing the history of the chapter alongside changes in the toy industry, including the rapid increase in surprise toys, and then also changes in the traditional media industry, from streamers to channels that begin to bring in influencers both into their libraries. So Hulu and Netflix have quite a lot of YouTube programming that is now sort of part of their library, but also into their pantheon of stars. So I'll just read you a little bit from the conclusion that kind of pulls some of this together in a bow. So what the case study hopes to demonstrate is that rather than just being one genre, one amateur YouTube video, that there's actually a complex web of stakeholders and influences that shape Ryan's World's engagement with the unboxing toy review genre and the brand that's built on that foundation. Ryan's World provides an important map for how influencers and YouTube native genres can impact more traditional media and merchandising for children, starting by featuring cars and PJ Masks in videos with official or homemade surprise toys, appeared to have initially increased those brands' visibility, but of course primarily the YouTube channel's visibility, and also interest in surprise toys in the toy industry, allowing multiple influencers, including Cookie Swirl C, to translate that into their own toy brands, mocking the toys that they originally unboxed themselves. Whether a direct or indirect influence, this relationship is being increasingly institutionalized, and Ryan's World's shift to mainstream toy merchandising and cable television provides a model for other toy influencers to follow, and are being followed. A few other children's toy influencers have already been tapped by Nick Jr. and other producers to create content. At the time of this writing, Nickelodeon has appeared to increase its commitment to programs led by social media stars, many from the unboxing genre. In short, video genres that originate on YouTube, like toy reviewer and unboxing videos, cannot be considered in isolation as reflections of larger moves towards prosumers, consumers who produce their own content, and digital media culture. Rather, they also must not only be regarded as competing with the toy industry and entertainment media industry for children's times. Rather, they are part of a complex and increasingly formal arrangement, and as such, they impact children's play and media consumption in ways that are only beginning to be explored. I want it to be fast before my child's tablet loses its allure. I'm happy to answer questions if we have time for that, or provide more context.
Excellent job, Kira, and I love the sound effects in the background too, as well. So, okay, so our next chapter is Toys That Train the Tots, Fisher-Price's Smart Toys in the Digital Age, written by myself and my co-author, Jody Pruitz-Cook, and I believe Jody is here and can speak to this chapter.
Yes, hi everyone, it's Judy, sorry.
Judy, sorry.
No worries, no worries. And I'm going to start off with a question for you. And this is a question I often ask my undergraduate students, so I know how they answer it, but we'll see how it works with this group. I'd like for you to all, if you have within arm's distance a smart device, hold it up. If you don't have your video on, just hit yes in reactions. Okay, so that was a pretty good showing of people who had a smart device within arm's reach. And I often wonder about this because I'm so interested in the role that technology plays in our lives. And I like to dial it back to, okay, well, where is this interest being born? And how are we using in the toy industry, how is the toy industry specifically using technology and marketing to children from the moment they're born? And Nancy and I partnered on this project, and I'm so grateful to have been involved. So thank you, Rebecca and Nancy, for bringing me in. And specifically, we wanted to look at smart toys with the integration of computers and electronic chips, looking at toys that had voice recognition, health tracking abilities, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, VR, artificial intelligence. These have been expanding in the last 20 years. And in fact, even as far back as 2004, a Wired magazine reported that 70% of the toys featured at the 2004 American International Toy Fair contained at least one microchip. So this fascinates me. And when Nancy and I were figuring out how to put this together, we wanted to look at the integration of digital features as it reinforces technology and device use. And we wanted to examine this phenomenon using a case study of the Fisher-Price Linkimals, which you may be familiar with, and how that goes. So I'm going to read you a paragraph from the chapter. In this chapter, we examine the design and marketing of the digital toy, detailing the shift to digital, as well as potential implications for play and child development, using Fisher-Price's lines of smart toys for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers as a case study. As context, we consider how digital makeovers have reimagined old toys, as well as the introduction of toy versions of tech gadgets kids often see their parents using. Cameras, laptops, mobile phones, tablets, robots, drones, remotes, microphones, recorders, smartwatches, and more. Then we examine marketing digital toys in the smart toys market, specifically those which Fisher-Price targets towards children under 5 years old, using marketing copy and parental reviews to better understand the promotion and marketing and reception of toys in this category. In so doing, this chapter sheds light on the toy industry's role in transitioning children from play consumers to actual consumers of digital electronics and the implication of that evolution for children and their parents. So there you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to guide us through the next set of chapters. And the next one is Commodifying Culture, Mattel's and Disney's Marketing Approaches to Latinx Toys and Media. And this is by Emily Aguilo Perez, who I believe is here. Emily, are you able to join us on screen? I know that you're traveling, which is why I was asking.
I'm in the car. Yes, but I think I'm looking right now to the so my interests are I do research on Barbie and children's literature, children's culture, so toys are part of that. And so I was excited to write this chapter where I combined two things that I enjoyed but also I'm critical of, which are Barbie and Disney. And in general, I was thinking of the more recent surge of toys and dolls, especially from both Disney and Mattel, of Latinx dolls like the Dia de los Muertos and Frida Kahlo Barbies, and then from Disney, Coco and Elena of Avalor, and how that there was this kind of resurgence of Latinx toys. And I do quotes because who are they marketing to, and who, like, how are they representing Latinx cultures there? So in my overview of how both companies approached Latinx, it seemed to me that Disney was at least being a little bit more, Mattel was being more kind of an amalgam of Latinx and being a little ambiguous in their marketing and what they produce as Latinx, whereas Disney was at least being more recently more concrete in, you know, using Coco and Mexican culture specifically, rather than just, you know, general Latinx. Although with Elena of Avalor, they were doing that, you know, amalgam of Latinx cultures, right? What I wanted to be, when I started looking at those toys, I wanted to see kind of the history of how they had done things in the past. And so with Disney, they hadn't really marketed anything as Latinx before, except for the 1940s with the movies, the Three Caballeros and Saludos Amigos. But then after that, there wasn't really a lot. And so in looking at the two companies, I was thinking of, or looking at their kind of dolls of the world with Mattel, and then with It's a Small World with Disney, which they released a very short-lived, like a limited edition dolls from that ride. So those are that's the excerpt that I'm going to read about, because it was really, for me, fun to look at those toys specifically before looking at the more recent ones. So I'll read, and here I talk about the kind of whiteness of the Latin American and Latinx dolls in the Dolls of the World Mattel line. While some Latin American countries and Latinx cultures have been represented by more than one Barbie, Mexico has been the most misrepresented, with 6 appearances in the collection and its specialty lines. Like other Latin American Barbies, most Mexican Barbie dolls have been dressed in colonial attire, emphasizing the Spanish influence. The packaging for the first Mexican Barbie doll, produced in 1989, described how her costume reflected, quote, the strong Spanish influence prevalent throughout her country in 1917. The product descriptions for subsequent Mexican Barbie doll iterations also highlighted the doll's clothing. She is, after all, a fashion doll, noting her jet black hair and, quote, fiesta costume, or her, quote unquote, bright pink ruffle dress that would make her ready for any fiesta. Such language served to reinforce the emphasis on Spanish influence and the erasure of indigenous cultures. The exception was 2001's Princess of Ancient Mexico Barbie doll, described as a, quote, beautiful Aztec princess, unquote, who lived in a royal palace. Although her representation of indigenous cultures was a welcome change from the colonialist representations of Latin American Barbies, the Princess of Ancient Mexico Barbie introduced a different problem. Many ancient indigenous cultures did not follow a hereditary royalty system that would produce a princess, and depicting her as an Indian princess relied on that stereotypical Eurocentric trope. For Disney, it produced a line comparable to the Dolls of the World, the Disney Animators Collection, It's a Small World dolls from 2013 and 2014. Unlike Dolls of the World, from which Mattel produced dolls representing a number of countries annually, these products appear to have been a one-time production featuring 8 countries that included Mexico and then Hawaii. These are smaller versions of the animatronics of the theme park ride, and each doll could sing It's a Small World in English and its native language. While Mattel's Dolls of the World descriptions were individualized, yet often problematic, Disney's packaging including the same description for all dolls in English and in French, and no information specific to the country represented. In marketing this line, then, Disney ignored language as a cultural element for each doll, and in turn, the potential buyers' identities, seeming to hail, as Mattel did through Dolls of the World, white doll collectors, perhaps capitalizing on consumers' nostalgia for the theme park ride, rather than diverse non-white people who might have appreciated seeing their cultures represented by a major brand. And also happy to answer questions later.
Thank you so much, Emily. So insightful. All right, so the next chapter in the volume is A Toy for Thoughtful Parents, The Rhetorical Building Blocks of Lego's Reputation by Lauren Dela Cruz at Hampton University. I believe Lauren couldn't be here today, but her chapter was really interesting because what she did is charted the history of how Lego has shifted its positioning of the brand in its discourse over the years. So she looked at all kinds of, internal documents, advertisements, and really tracked from the start of the brand to where they are today, with all of these shifts in between, in really responding to changing parenting norms over the decades. So she kind of noticed how they repositioned themselves to fit with dominant ideas about what parenting should be. So it was very, very interesting. The next chapter is by Avi Santo, who unfortunately also couldn't be here today. Smart is the New Cool, Project MC Squared, and the Marketing of STEM Lifestyles to Tween Girls. The product that he looked at was a tween STEM-oriented toy, and the chapter really did a nice job of exploring the tensions between its framing as a STEM toy in relation to the fact that it simultaneously really didn't buck gender norms at all, right? So there are some underlying tensions in the product and the way that it was marketed that he explores nicely in the chapter. Additionally, on a similar theme of sort of STEM toys, we have Margot Lipman at Dutchess Community College, who I believe also couldn't be here today. Hacking Girl Power, the Goldie Blox play sets and material rhetoric. And folks might recall Goldie Blox as a very popular brand several years back that got a lot of attention for presenting girls with play sets that were STEM oriented. But there, again, very similarly to what we're hearing elsewhere, there's some tensions in taking the concept of STEM toys, but packaging them aligned with gender norms and framing things in terms of girl power, which we know is kind of a complex and often self-contradictory concept. Another chapter that, similar to the one Nancy mentioned earlier, was from an international vantage point. Trine Kvidal Rovik from the Arctic University of Norway framed her analysis of the toy discourses and gendered roles in the most gender equal country in the world, a critical cultural analysis of Norwegian toy catalogs from 2011 to 2018, by really saying, okay, look, Norway has a reputation as being the most gender equal country in the world, but let's see what's happening and how toys are marketed. And, you know, the reality in her very, very careful analysis of a really good sample set of toy catalogs was that, yeah, the gender roles that we complain about in the US and in England and other you know, countries that have had a lot of publicity around these issues in recent years are also reflected even in this country with its reputation for egalitarianism. So it helps show in a global context how far we still have to go. Next, I'm happy to introduce Emily Zaslow, who is here from Pace University. She collaborated with Jacqueline Griffith, who has her MA from the University of Rhode Island, on a chapter called Unpacking Logan, the Construction of Masculinity in the American Girl Boy Doll. And as some of you may know, Emily has written a wonderful book on the American Girl doll previously and has a really excellent depth of knowledge in this area. So Emily, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for including me in the collection. So this work kind of departs a bit. Most of my work on American Girl looks at the historical collection, and that's what I've been really invested in. And in this piece, I look at a contemporary doll. I'm assuming you all know what the American Girl doll collection is, so I won't get into that. But in 2017, for the first time, the American Girl doll collection introduced a male doll that had a storyline and some accessories. And that doll was Logan, and he was the male counterpart to Tenny, who was a doll character who was a tween country singer. And I'll just show you kind of, this is Tenny and Logan. And so Jacqueline, who was a former student of mine and fabulous student who went on to get a master's, and I looked at the construction of masculinity in the American Girl doll collection. So we asked two questions. One is, well, three. Okay, what is the construction? What does the construction of masculinity look like in this particular case in the American Girl collection? And then, you know, in relation to that, how does that then also construct Tenny's femininity in contrast? Because you can see, even from the advertising, they're really constructed as dichotomous to one another. The brown hair versus the blonde hair, the, you know, kind of muted blue-green colors versus Tenny's pink. The way in which Tenny and the model here have this kind of connection to beauty culture, that they're, you know, staring off into the same direction while Logan's looking in this other direction. So there's definitely a play between her femininity and his masculinity. That's part of that construction. So we looked at that both in the catalog as well as in the narrative, the books that go along with that. So there's a whole series of books. Sorry, my blur is on. A whole series of books that goes along with the Tenny character. And we also looked at the way in which consumers responded to that marketing. So, how does a company that's girl-centric and has a rhetoric of girl power introduce masculinity, and then how do consumers respond to that? And in particular, we were looking at how do they respond to that in 2017, because he was released shortly after Donald Trump was elected. And so a lot of the consumer response was, there were definitely some positive responses, this idea that we can kind of break down gender binary and allow boys to play with dolls and encourage girls to play with boy dolls, although it really was marketed more toward girls and not toward boys, which is something we explored as well. But how did consumers respond? And there were many angry consumers who felt like Logan was not only an interloper into the girl space, but represented a hegemonic white masculinity, somebody who was a sexual predator. Like, he was painted, even though he's a young doll with no history of this, as a character painted as a sexual predator, as somebody who was going to disrupt the girl space. So I can read a little bit from our chapter, which I'm sorry, I screwed up and don't have it open. So I will read a little bit that's not in our chapter, but taken from there. So we found that in both product design and narrative construction, American Girl failed to challenge gender norms. Logan's fictional persona created him as a loud, emotionally distant, cymbal-crashing drummer, while in contrast, his female bandmate Tenny is portrayed as a pink-clad, melodic, guitar-playing girl who sings her feelings and is responsible for the duo's emotional labor. We argued that the doll's messaging, which reifies hegemonic masculinity and normative femininity, was problematic and ultimately unsuccessful. Logan, the doll, failed. He was taken off the market and no subsequent male doll has been introduced, partly because the Logan doll diverged too starkly from the brand's identity and so didn't mirror what the consumers wanted from this brand identity. And then for many children and collectors, Logan had the potential to become a beloved plaything, but to others, his arrival in the American Girl universe was emblematic of the white male privilege to occupy space, steal the spotlight, earn accolades for less work, and overpower girls and women. His entry into the collection only months after an openly misogynist white man succeeded in winning the election over what could have been the first female US president felt like another injury to many consumers who valued the American Girl brand's girl-centric identity. So we're really hoping that our chapter sheds lights on some of the challenges of gender diverse marketing and provides support for the argument that inclusion itself does not necessarily introduce counter-hegemonic ideologies. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Let me pull my screen back up again. Okay, and then the final chapter in the collection is actually mine. The Politics of Barbie's Curvy New Body, Marketing Mattel's Fashionistas line. I'm curious, how many of you have heard about this particular Barbie line? Can I see a show of hands? Anyone? Mattel did so much publicity to draw attention to a new Barbie line that they created in 2016 called the Fashionistas, which differentiate themselves from the typical Barbie by having several different new body types, as well as a wider range of skin tones and hair textures. So it's more physically diverse and more racially and ethnically diverse. What really interested me in approaching this chapter was Mattel's decisions surrounding the launch, their choice to really emphasize the body differences and not really play up the racial and ethnic differences, and how closely they worked with Time magazine, as well as other outlets, to ensure that the coverage would be in the direction that they wanted it to be. They were very concerned behind the scenes about how the public would react to these significant changes to this legacy brand, which is known for having a light blonde haired, pale skinned, buxom, super thin to the point of being unrealistic, right? There have been studies that have said, what size would Barbie be if she were human? Actually, she wouldn't be alive because it's so extreme, right? And they were just so worried about there being possibilities of backlash that they were very careful in how they handled this launch. Now, I want to show you the curvy Barbie that was the cause of such interest and controversy. I have one of them. And of course, I got the girl power one because I have a book called Growing Up with Girl Power. But as you can see, you know, she's got some hips, but she's still recognizable as a Barbie. It was really interesting to see just how much attention they were able to get for these, you know, relatively minor changes to the brand, but also the reception from different quarters. And sort of not dissimilarly to Emily's chapter in looking at how there were sort of competing receptions, one of the things that I'd like to talk about a little bit today in reading from my chapter are really the politics of fat surrounding this doll. The curvy Barbie mold, by the way, would scale up to, rather than a woman that's a size like 00, would scale up to a woman that is a size 4. So we're talking about it being curvy, but we really can't understand curvy as a euphemism for fat in this context, because there is no way, shape, or form in which a size 4 human being would be considered overweight or fat or whatever language you choose to use. Now, the cover story that I reference when I read this was a Time 2016. It featured on the cover a full-bodied Barbie doll with the blonde hair. It looked very, very clearly the white blonde Barbie. And she was backlit against a very, very dark, I think, black background. And below the doll were the words, "Now can we stop talking about my body? What Barbie's new shape says about American beauty." So we have a doll emphasizing that it's the curvy Barbie, and you can see she's got the tiniest little bit of extra curve there. And it says, "Now can we stop talking about my body?" Interesting, you know, sort of conflict between what they actually want you to do and what they claim they want you to do. So here is a little bit of what I found about the reception after looking at the launch and the marketing tactics. Time's cover story and Mattel's press release succeeded in setting the tone for much ensuing media coverage as intended. News reports placed primary emphasis upon the fashionistas' body types, making other forms of diversity secondary. The mainstream media tended to present the fashionistas and curvy Barbies release in neutral to favorable terms. Some merely summarized key points from Time and perhaps hinted at a dubious perspective. Others embraced curvy Barbie as reflecting body positivity, with Shape calling curvy Barbie, quote, "totally inspiring," and People praising fashionistas as offering a, quote, "new body positive spectrum." This coverage dovetails with Dr. Min's remark, who authored the timepiece, that in researching the timepiece, she realized that caring about body image is common to, quote, "mothers across America," end quote, and that she had been, quote, "very wrong" to think that the concerns were unique to, quote, "millennial moms who frequent feminist blogs." Nevertheless, curvy Barbie's reception varied, and two major strains of criticism evidenced a political divide: progressive versus conservative. Some mainstream to liberal outlets critiqued Mattel for characterizing a slender doll as curvy, noting accurately that in the general population, the doll represents a smaller than average body type. The Detroit Free Press questioned whether curvy Barbie truly promotes body acceptance and diversity, noting, quote, "aside from being a little larger, her proportions aren't that different from those of traditional Barbie. She too has an idealized figure." Likewise, Mashable noted Mattel was late to the game and responded by profiling long-established body-positive dolls such as Emmy and Lamely and dubbing them, quote, "better than Barbie." At the other extreme, some conservative outlets and audience members ran with the interpretation that curvy equals fat and expressed revulsion, anticipating this potential response in a, quote, "defensive strategy." Mattel had partnered with doctors, child psychologists, consultants, and other influencers to help circulate their pro-social message. While this carried the mainstream, curvy Barbie's story varied depending on who's telling it, with conservative commenters, quote, "on the lookout for politically correct overcorrections, chalking the whole thing up to liberal pandering or even the rapid extinction of desirable women," end quote. For example, right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, called Curvy Barbie, quote, the product of a social justice warrior's fantasies. Using adjectives such as monstrous and unsightly, and dubbing it frumpy, thunder thigh sporting ham planet Barbie, Yiannopoulos sarcastically praised the doll for teaching girls what kind of unsightly woman to avoid becoming. Through his sarcastic exaggerations, though his sarcastic exaggerations were meant to amuse Breitbart's target audience, by linking the doll's size to the specter of social justice warriors, Yiannopoulos' discourse brings to mind Lebesco's argument that fat bodies are forms of protest, constituting a political threat to received norms. And just jumping ahead a little bit, the vilification of feminists as tormentors brings us full circle to the cover story, which voiced Curvy Barbie as pleading, now can we stop talking about my body? The answer clearly is no, there is too much at stake for girls and our culture. Thank you. So I believe, unless any contributors have joined us late and are available to speak to their chapters that we already skimmed by, I believe we are up to the question and answer portion of today. So we would be very happy to answer any questions that folks have here. Also happy to have some back and forth between various contributors who might have questions for their colleagues about their work. Is there anyone who would like to offer a question, comment, or remark in response to our overview of the book? If so, feel free to unmute yourself, jump right in.
Rebecca, I just want to say thank you for the two of you putting together this book. This is a really, really important book, and I'm thrilled that you did it, and I really look forward to reading it.
Oh,
Thanks.
Susan, thank you so much. And thank you for being here. For those who may not be aware, Susan is an incredible advocate for children as consumers and their rights. And she is, among other things, the author of the book Consuming Kids, which has been very influential. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
I'm delighted, and it's really, really exciting, and also a discussion that's really needed right now.
Thank you. What other questions or comments do folks have?
Hi, I don't have a specific question. I'm a student at Salem State. I'm majoring in graphic design, and I'm going to be doing my honors thesis next semester. So I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation, because I'm going to be analyzing like the children's consumer industry in regards to the way that like sugary cereal products are marketed to children and how that's kind of manipulated. So I know it's not the same thing, but it's really interesting to hear some of the parallels between how children's toys are marketed and some of the stuff I'm researching. So thank you so much. It was really important to hear about, and I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much for coming. And yeah, keep me posted on that project. That's really interesting. There's so much to be said about marketing to children beyond toys specifically. But for this volume, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we were just interested in honing in on toys because of how related to media and the children's media texts that they enjoy are. But there's so much more to say in all these other areas. Thank you for doing that work.
Thank you.
You know, that actually reminds me of something that the discussion of gendered STEM marketing made me think of too, which is that I was just in the baking aisle, and you really all should take a look at Betty Crocker partnering with Barbie and promoting STEM through baking. Rebecca, I hope you won't mind if I ask, do you see a continuation of the conservative backlash against these Barbies in the uproar over the potato heads?
You know, I really do think that there is a very interesting tendency where there's liberal responses to updates to toys in their marketing and conservative responses. And it's almost become predictable at this point. Similar to the potato heads, and say, oh no, how can we degender potatoes? Which, I mean, you can, right? I look at it as of a piece also with the almost hysteria when Target announced that they were desegregating their toy aisles, which honestly was such a minor change that it's hardly noticeable. And also when they said that they would have the Cat and Jack clothing line rollout, right? If we look outside toys, I went on a talk show in Boston, Nightside with Dan Ray, and just talked about some of that a little when I had written a piece for the Washington Post about some of that. And it was a call-in show, and they kept me there for like 2 hours. I was happy to be there, but most of the callers were like, but boys should be boys and girls should be girls. And it's like, offering more choices doesn't change anything. It's just honoring people's right to make choices about what products interest them, right? We don't say that there are jobs for adults who are men and jobs for adults who are women, right? We don't identify jobs by gender anymore, but we still tend to do that in the toy aisles and other areas. So, you know, for some reason that continues to raise ire.
If I can, thank you so much. This was awesome. I'm Brian. I'm actually a faculty in graphic design at Salem State University. And I can't help but notice I'm apparently the only male participant here. I think there were some earlier, and I'm wondering if that, I don't know my question. It's an observation, and I wonder if any of you could address why do you imagine that this is an issue that women are more primarily concerned with, or are there, what's the sociological implication of just the screen that I'm seeing right now? Thanks.
Kira, go ahead and jump in. I'm sure you have a great answer to that one.
I don't know if I have a great answer, but I have a little bit of an answer because I teach a children's media class, and I tend to get a lot of female students and a handful of male students who often tell me, I just really need a sociocultural class. But then I ended up actually really liking it because I like Avatar, and now I've learned something about Avatar. And I think that there's just a larger cultural orientation where women are encouraged to orient themselves in relationship to children even before they have children. Certainly there are many scholars who come to this after they have children. I started before I had children. None of my students have children, but they babysit. They think of themselves as someday parents. They think of themselves as maybe wanting to make children's content or educational content because they perceive that as pro-social. And so they've had like this lifetime orientation towards children that I think is less common for men. Although of course, like you said, Avi Santo isn't here, but is in the book, and there's several other male scholars who do work in the area of children. But I think it tends to dominate, in my experience, even in the classroom, who's drawn to that class, who perceives themselves as belonging in that class. And I think that has to do with the socialization, as Rebecca says, to target in the toy aisle, or some of the really early work on girls' toy shows and boys' toy shows that talk about Strawberry Shortcake and how those shows are written around nurturing. Girls are scripted to nurture from a very young age, that then expresses itself, I think, also potentially in scholarly or classroom interests. That's my totally unfounded hypothesis based on observation and not like actual rigorous inquiry.
Thank you. And I see Spring has her hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to say, in relation to my chapter, one of the fascinating things I found about the way that minimalism is co-opted and the discussion around minimalism takes place is that male writers tend to be these almost lone wolves, prowling about and practicing minimalism as a sort of Zen master performance. And there's been a lot of criticism of that because it often relies on, okay, while you're off trekking with no possessions, maybe mom has all your stuff in storage, or home base is your parents' house, or you're really very, very privileged and very Caucasian and childless for the most part. There's one notable exception who does talk about his kids, contrasting with what I focused on the most, which has, of course, like mommy bloggers, been dubbed minimalist mom or mommy minimalism, where it is very much oriented in the home, in the family, in children's toys, in minimalism as promoting children's happiness and intellectual endeavors and cognitive development, and freeing that mom from so much housework and so much clutter. And it is just a very dichotomous discourse around minimalism that once again roots women's interests in home and childcare and housework, and minimalism is freeing men from all of that and having sort of the open road van life experience. So just in my chapter alone, that social construction of toy culture around motherhood is paramount.
And Emily.
Yeah, and I'll add, I mean, Kira, I think what you were claiming is absolutely founded. It wasn't just your opinion. It's all over the literature. So don't belittle your knowledge of that literature. But I mean, that's even looking at so many of our chapters. I mean, when American Girl introduced a boy doll, they didn't introduce it to a boy market. They intended to introduce it to a girl market. That perpetuation of girls' identity with childhood, with mothering, with care. And then when they did introduce the boy doll, he was emotionally distant, and the girl was responsible for the emotional care and the emotional labor of their relationship. So you see that perpetuation of, emotional labor and motherhood, and then children is that, through line. And then, of course, mothers as responsible for, if we're talking specifically about the marketing of toys, mothers' labor as responsible for populating the playroom, right? And buying the toys and making decisions about toys, and the types of toys that will be in the household. So I think that's another reason why we see primarily female scholars in this area.
Hi, I have a question. So it seems like from your summaries of your chapters, you're raising really, really important and complicated issues. Do you also talk about solutions in the book? Or is this just not just, but is this we are in serious trouble and, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it isn't really an applied volume where we lay out solutions, although I think that it could be a launching pad for further conversations about ways to address the issues that are brought up throughout it. I also think that, it's with Palgrave, which is an academic press, and I believe they are really expecting a very academic audience. I could imagine a similar volume with a trade press, taking similar topics and actually being very deliberate in translating issue identified and possible solution. So yeah, but thank you. It's such a good question. I always am inclined to want to offer solutions, but it's not always a good fit within a certain type of volume.
Mm-hmm. And so your hope for this book is that it's used in college classrooms primarily and to stimulate discussion. Is that right?
Yeah, it's scholarly. So for folks who are writing in this area to inform their literature, and also in college classrooms. Honestly, it's the kind of book that I wish I had when I was writing my Growing Up with Girl Power book and was trying to make sense of, wow, I'm talking to girls about their media use, but they keep talking to me about the toys that are related to their media, and lacking a framework to bring those things together and really look at, okay, how does the toy piece fit with media studies? I actually think that that's the unique contribution here, is helping articulate how the toy piece fits with media studies. Nancy, do you have anything to add on that one? I don't mean to keep speaking for the two of us, because I know that Nancy has a wealth of knowledge in this area as well.
Yeah, and I feel like you addressed the volume very well. I do see it as more of a critique and a deeper analysis than necessarily the solutions. I also think perhaps if we had the solutions, we wouldn't be writing these types of books, so we could actually do them. So it is a problematic area, and it definitely could use some energy to try to address some of these disparities and that we're witnessing. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, one other thing I just thought of is that in so many cases, what we are exploring are companies' attempts to present solutions. So Mattel was directly responding to criticisms that Barbie's too thin and is unhealthy for girls. American Girl dolls were directly responding to this clamoring for boy dolls from parents. I believe that Disney and Mattel in the Latinx products were responding to a perceived need in the marketplace. But the concept of how they respond, with the best of intentions, the execution doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the actual consumer, which I think goes back to structural problems in the industry where you don't necessarily have enough representation from the people that these products are meant for making the decisions. Oh, I see Emily's hand is up. Emily?
In my chapter, I mean, I don't offer like a concrete, here's how we solve all the issues, but one thing that I noticed was I talk about how Mattel in their marketing of Latinx products, it was always in the background, even with Teresa, the Latinx or the Latina doll of the Barbie line. She was Latina only in special occasions like the quinceañera, and some other like special edition Barbies. Otherwise, she's kind of like in the margins, just like other diverse Barbie friends. And in my chapter, I don't talk about this a lot because I focus on the toys, but even in new media like shows, there's a diverse cast of friends, but Barbie, the white blonde, is still at the center. So Disney has tried to address, and maybe not perfectly, definitely not perfectly, with some, creating content that is more, Latina at the center. But with Mattel, there's still that, marginalization. And so for me, it was something that I brought in my solution, that Mattel needs to be more so if we're talking about diversity and trying to appeal.
I think maybe we've lost Emily's audio. Sorry, Emily, we'll come back to you later. You're frozen.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you.
No. Okay. Just saying, centering these diverse bodies and dolls.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Great. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm really grateful to everyone who was able to join us today to get this book launched. Are there any final questions before we wrap up? Open to any question or remark that folks might have.
Hey, I was just saying in the chat that I think it's really interesting to look at positive examples, because in some ways it's like you were saying, like, the Mattel was like trying to respond to it, and in some ways it's almost like, if we look at it from any perspective, we can always find something to critique. Like, nothing will ever be perfect. Like, anyone will find something, but I think nonetheless, so it'd be very curious to see, like, this is a very smart group of people who are good at not nitpicking in a good way. That's a good thing. But it'd be really cool then, like, are there other examples that we're like, that we can all be like, yes, this is done well? Because I think that'd be really interesting to study and then start pull solutions from there. Because I think that when we pull solutions from things not done well, that doesn't always get applied correctly. So like they go too far one way, or like, the Betty Crocker example now, like, I know what Barbie's trying to do with this, and you can see their good intentions, right? But it's like, you can always you know, or and I think also terms change over time and meanings and interpretations and stuff. So anyways, I just think that could be a really cool thing. And I wonder if there's papers or books that have done that. Probably. I mean, obviously
Well,
there's
Colleen, if I may jump in, I will say that I do contrast what I've shared today with bloggers and products that are sort of doing the DIY, ad-free, low-cost version of what is being commodified. So I don't know if that gets at what you're talking about in terms of an intervention, but it is contrasting with sort of what is being commodified. So anyway, yeah, I think that's an excellent point though.
I love the idea of a collection or paper on, you know, what's being done well, right? That I think would make an interesting contribution. But, you know, I think one of the challenges with that too is how do you really evaluate what's done well, right? Because like even looking at the diversification of the Barbie dolls, there are some people who will say this is terrific because they are adding diversity, but then you hear from other folks who say, oh, this, you know, but is this tokenizing? Is it diverse enough? What about this group? What about that group? So it seems like there's always, even if something's done well, there's always something that could be done better. And maybe that's the way to frame it, right? Is okay, this was done really well, and let's do a little case study of what could be done even better. Yeah.
And then it's like, was it financially successful? Because if we talk about solutions and real change, if we can't prove this is still like marketing is marketing for a reason, like there is a business goal, and that's not an evil thing. That's just how the world works, right? And we have to acknowledge that. If we want to see solutions, we have to make sure it's, you know, there's a reason that, you know, the businesses will actually take it on because it's a good thing and it will still serve the purpose. So it's tricky.
Yeah, and you know, that's one of the things that I do talk about in my Curvy Barbie chapter, despite the backlash and people saying, oh, you know, she's so fat, kids aren't going to like her. People vote with their feet, right? In the marketplace, they vote with their dollars, they go purchase the products, and actually the outcome was Mattel's sales hit record highs. They had been in a slump, and the Fashionistas' infusion of diversity, and it's hard to tease out whether it was the body type diversity or the range of racial and ethnic diversity or the combination of the two. But it really did a lot to reinvigorate that legacy brand that had been in a bit of a slump for several consecutive years. So that is something that when I've given media interviews on the subject and people say, well, but is this really making a difference? Well, consumers are voting for it. So maybe that will encourage the brands to go more in that direction and other brands to do the same thing, right? So you can see the potential for ripple effects in the marketplace as well. Yeah, such an important conversation. I love these questions. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, so what I'd like to do is just share my screen one last time because Palgrave did give us a special code for 20% off the printed book or the ebook for the launch. So if anyone would like this, I can actually also drop it in the chat. I would have to close my my PowerPoint to do that. But you know, we are really grateful to everyone for joining us today and really appreciated the conversation. It's just such a pleasure to see so many contributors and so many people who are interested in this subject area. There's so much that we can do, and it is really wonderful that we have this avenue to do these things together. So thank you.
Thank you. Amazing.
Thanks, Rebecca and Nancy.
Thank you very much.
Possible.
Great
the book
talk.
and the talk. Yes.
Thank you.